Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Daily Defender. Glad to be with everybody again. Glad you're with us and spending some time with us. Welcome back to the channel. Have some really interesting things that we want to talk about today, as you can probably see on the table. But I think before we jump over to that, just our usual admin and just a very warm welcome to all the new subscribers. Thank you very much for subscribing to the channel. As I've mentioned before, we can't really move the channel forward without that, and it's amazing the number of subscribers that you need to even get to a base level. So please continue to subscribe. Please continue to share information and like things that you see on the channel. Also, thank you for all of the comments. Just great comments recently. And it's really great to be engaging with you and talking with you all and sharing information. That's been, again, as I've always said, that's one of probably the most fun things about this channel, not only talking about firearms, but engaging with you folks. So without further ado, the firearm obviously that we want to talk about today is another pretty iconic firearm within Smith & Wesson. Certainly the cartridge is, and this is going to be the model 4006 in 40 Smith & Wesson. And it's very important, or has a very interesting timeline within Smith & Wesson, because once again, we're going to touch on the 1986 Miami shootout, the FBI Miami shootout. And that particular event and its timeline is directly associated with this particular pistol, or at least in a secondary nature. I guess you'd have to say the direct association with that event is the Smith & Wesson 1076 and 10 millimeter. And we'll talk about that in the deep dive because we have to, because there's a lineage here and a start point, but there's also some things starting or happening simultaneously within Smith & Wesson and cartridge development. Not necessarily cartridge development for 10 millimeter, because that was already around for a little while. And again, we'll talk through some of that. But this 40 Smith & Wesson caliber and cartridge that they come up with in the mid to late 80s, and then build this particular pistol, this model 4006, around that. And the other firearms on the table have some direct or indirect relationship with this discussion as well. So this is going to be a really interesting topic. We're going to get a little bit into the caliber and ballistic side, like I said initially, because we have to have that baseline before we move into the pistol. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pistol and compare it to some of the other ones on the table, and even some other 40 caliber pistols that I have some familiarity with, etc. So again, welcome to the channel, and without any further ado, let's jump straight into the model 4006 from Smith & Wesson. Right, so as I just introduced, we want to do our deep dive and talk a little bit further about the Smith & Wesson 4006. And as I alluded to in the intro video, this is a very, very interesting firearm, really for a number of reasons, and we'll get into the firearm itself. But you really have to take a step backwards and, I think, understand some time frames and some cartridge development and some ballistics requirements that kind of surround this particular cartridge. The pistol itself is obviously, maybe not obviously, but is a third generation Smith & Wesson. And as we've, semi-auto, double action, single action. And as we've discussed before, this is basically a 1990s platform. Third generation started to come out in the late 80s, 88, 89. But the bulk of the production was in the mid-90s, and I think most people consider it a 90s platform, as we've talked about before as well. The third generation bleeds into the early 2000s, depending on specific contracts. But this 4006 is a very good example of the 90s platform, because it was introduced in 1990 and ended production in 1999. So it falls right into that category, or that range, of these third generation Smiths in the 1990s. And again, just great firearms. I was actually in the shop today talking to a gentleman about third gen Smiths, and he was again very complimentary of them, and enjoyed them as well. So it was actually great talking with him. But as I mentioned, we really need to go backwards a little bit on where this came from and why Smith and Wesson brought this firearm to market. So we'll have a little bit of a history lesson here without getting into writing a history book. But we need to essentially start around 1986, and as I alluded to in the intro video, this very serious situation, or the 1986 Miami FBI Miami shootout. And again, as we've talked about, it's kind of a watershed moment for law enforcement. There's numerous situations or occurrences throughout the history of U.S. law enforcement, and some actually change doctrine and training doctrine and equipment selection, etc. And the FBI 1986 Miami shootout is absolutely one of those. In fact, it's probably one of the most well documented and well researched events, I think, within law enforcement. I guess if you take September 11th out of the equation, but from a shootout standpoint, the amount of detailed information and what they took away from that event is pretty amazing. So, yeah, I'm going to have a little bit of a history lesson here. So, again, the event, and we don't need to go deep into the event. And if you're not overly familiar with the FBI shootout, absolutely research it. It's fascinating for a whole number of reasons. And again, we won't get into the weeds on that. But essentially, after that event occurs, and the FBI does its investigation and review, it comes to the conclusion that a number of the firearms that were used and calibers that were used in that event were deemed insufficient for the task at hand, and that was taking down these two very violent and well-trained bank robbers. And so the FBI is looking at their data, and they're basically have come to the conclusion in not too many years after that. Again, 86 is the shootout, and within a few years, the FBI concludes and comes basically to the table with a new ballistic requirement for ammunition, and it centers around a lot of with regards to penetration, bullet penetration into a subject, and through also barriers, denim, or I shouldn't say denim at this point, but window glass, etc. The ballistics doctrine that they come up with, as probably many of you know, is the gelatin block with the 3 or 4 layers of denim and the minimum penetration level of 12 inches. And so the FBI puts all of this data together and determines that they need a different pistol and cartridge for their agents. They initially settle on the 10 millimeter. And again, if we take one more step back, the 10 millimeter was a relatively new cartridge. If I remember right, it was introduced right around the early 80s. I don't think they had the 10 millimeter in a pistol cartridge in the 70s, so I think it was early 80s. And the FBI determines that this is really the ideal cartridge. And I think also some folks consider the 10 millimeter kind of like a 41 Magnum. And anyways, the FBI determines that that is the cartridge that they want to utilize. And they work with Smith & Wesson to develop the 1076 at that time and incorporate this 10 millimeter cartridge. And they actually utilize a pistol very similar to this. This is the model 4506, and it's a in 45 ACP. It's also a 3rd generation firearm, but you can see this is a large firearm. This is considerably larger than our 4006 here. And I should state at this point, every firearm is unloaded, and we've all checked these before the video, but again, to make everybody comfortable, we have safe and clear firearms. But this 4506 is a very, very large handgun, but it's essentially what the FBI chooses as its platform for the 10 millimeter, and eventually it becomes the Model 1076. And they launch it, or they introduce it, they issue it to FBI agents. And unfortunately, not soon thereafter, they start to have trouble with the 10 millimeter. The 10 millimeter cartridge has a lot of recoil. The firearm is very large, as I'm showing you here. Small statute agents are having trouble with the recoil and the physical size of the firearm. And if memory serves me right, they actually also start to have trouble with the firearms themselves from a reliability and function standpoint. So they kind of get themselves into this 10 millimeter, the FBI does, that is, but then is also starting to realize that maybe this isn't the exact right cartridge and pistol for them. And that 10 millimeter is launched in the late 80s, I think, 1989, if I remember correctly, or maybe even 1990. It's interesting because, as I stated, this pistol, the 4006, is introduced in 1990. So it seems pretty obvious that there were two things happening simultaneously. The FBI was wanting to develop and utilize the 10 millimeter cartridge with Smith & Wesson. At the same time, it appears that Smith & Wesson as a company was working on this 40 caliber cartridge. And so that's very interesting to me, because I was a little confused on that a while back, on how the 10 millimeter was introduced basically at the same time as the 40 caliber, essentially assuming and understanding that the FBI was the one really driving all this, and they were, but I think within their own project data, or their own project event, Smith & Wesson was doing its thing on the other side, or in parallel, as the 40 caliber. So it's just very, very interesting to me. Another part of this Smith & Wesson history that comes into play. In this case, it's, cartridges and ballistics. And again, so now we kind of, again, not fast forward, but we continue to slide down this time scale where this 10 millimeter really isn't working out for the FBI. And Smith & Wesson, I think, is realizing this. They're obviously, in step with what's going on with the 10 millimeter. And in 1990, they introduce the 40 Smith & Wesson, and I believe it's with Winchester. I believe Winchester was kind of the cartridge partner with Smith & Wesson for this 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. And if you're interested in what these kind of look like, I'll put the two cartridges here. And I'll put the 10 millimeter on the left and the 40 on the right. And you can see they are definitely, the 40 is definitely smaller. And a lot of times you'll hear the 40 referred to as a neck down 10 millimeter. And that's true. Now, we're obviously oversimplifying all of the engineering and ballistics capability and everything that needed to go into that, because essentially Smith & Wesson wanted the 40 Smith & Wesson caliber to have the same performance characteristics of the 10 millimeter. So though all of the new FBI ballistic requirements that we talked about, with penetration and expansion and barrier, defeating certain barriers, Smith & Wesson basically had to ensure that the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge did everything the 10 millimeter did. And it did. And I think that's why it became so successful as a law enforcement cartridge. And, again, we obviously see a lot of law enforcement now moving back to the 9 millimeter. Very, very capable cartridge. I think we all agree with that now. The ballistics and cartridge technology for 9 millimeter are drastically different than what they were in that 1986 FBI Miami shootout, where there were 9 millimeter firearms used. But we know that law enforcement now, current state, is moving back to the 9 millimeter. And we certainly know that the 9 millimeter within the gelatin and denim and all of that seems to perform quite well. I just wonder if it really does perform as well in some of these, defeating some of these certain barriers and still allowing the penetration that's needed. And of course, we know we've got, bonded bullets, etc., with the 9 millimeter, keeping the cartridge together to defeat certain barriers. But I just wonder if, it's kind of human nature to forget things, and just wondering if some of that understanding and data with the 40 Smith and Wesson from a penetration standpoint is I wonder if that's being lost. Now that's obviously on the law enforcement side. On the civilian side, I think this whole movement, if you will, or this large movement, or this middle ground movement to 9 millimeter makes all the sense in the world, because it does seem to now, with the latest bullet and cartridge technology, seems to have all of the penetration characteristics that we need as civilians for self-defense, with gelatin and clothing layers, etc. And obviously for civilians, we're not normally shooting into cars or out of cars, etc. That would be a rather extreme case. So I think for civilians, I think the 9 millimeter, with all of its capabilities and capacity and low recoil, etc., is a perfect, or near perfect, should we say, cartridge. But it is interesting to me that law enforcement has moved back to this 9 mil off of the 40. But it is what it is. And again, I just wanted to kind of show that comparison between the 40 and the 10 millimeter. So again, very, very interesting in that regard. And again, this whole connection with law enforcement and really the 40. I think it was the first new cartridge for Smith and Wesson since they developed the 357 Magnum cartridge, and I think that was in the mid-30s, if I remember right, 1935, mid-30s, I think. So it was definitely a groundbreaking cartridge, not only for Smith and Wesson, but the firearms industry in general. And I'm sure there's a lot of you that have a lot of knowledge and information on that. So here again, we would love to see some comments. I assume there's definitely some former LEOs that can kind of comment maybe on what departments were thinking, or what information they were given, or did they review what the FBI had done, and is that why they chose the 40, etc. So we would love to hear those comments. So that's going back, and so that's kind of our history lesson here to start with. And I guess I just don't think you can ignore that when you're talking about the 4006. So that's our base point. I guess maybe the next thing that we can talk about this particular pistol is, if you think this looks a little bit like a 5906, you would be correct in your assumption. And again, we have another clear and safe firearm, but that was another one of the firearms that I had on the table, which is a 5906 in 9 millimeter, and again, a clear and safe firearm. And again, as I mentioned, if you think that perhaps there were some or a lot of similarities between the two pistols, you're absolutely correct, because Smith & Wesson, again, was trying to get to a cartridge that not only, again, performed like the 10 millimeter, but had more of a firearm platform of the 9 millimeter. They knew this worked. They knew this worked in terms of size and capacity and smaller hands, etc. So there's absolutely a linkage or lineage between the 5906 and 9 millimeter and the 4006. And the main differences essentially are that the slide is thicker, and it's a little heavier to accommodate the 40 Smith & Wesson. The frame rails are thicker, so you have this portion of the frame here is wider and thicker, and you can kind of see that. I don't think it'll come up on the video. Maybe it will. Yeah, I think you can. You can see this line here is darker because this material is deeper down here. So there's more of a ridge or ledge here on the 5906 than there is on the 4006, indicating that this portion of the frame is definitely wider and beefier. So you had a beefier slide, you had a beefier frame, and if I remember correctly, there was also another point to that. Yeah, they heat treated the frame as well. So they were heat treating these particular stainless steel frames, and I can't remember if Smith & Wesson eventually went to that with all of their pistols, or if it was only initially on the 4006s, or it was just on the 4006 specifically. Again, maybe a viewer knows that in terms of these heat treated frames. So there's definitely a difference, and of course, all of that adds to weight. This is about a 40-ounce firearm, and again, all stainless steel, just as the 5906 was here. But there's a noticeable difference when I pick up this 5906 and now I pick up this 4006. There's a noticeable difference in weight. I don't remember what the 5906 was. I want to say 28 ounces or so, or 29. So it's probably a 10-ounce difference between the two firearms. So so we have that, and if I recall right, also the firearm was only supplied, at least initially, I can't remember if that changed through the 9 years of production, but initially was only offered with the flat backstrap. If you remember or know from some of the other videos, the 3rd gen firearms were supplied either with a flat backstrap or slightly curved or humped backstrap, but the 4006 was only supplied, again, at least initially, with a flat backstrap. The checkering on the front of the frame, and we're kind of getting into the deep dive now, is definitely a coarser, more aggressive checkering on the front here. You can see that. The rest of the pistol, I guess we can kind of just jump into that, is really very similar, again, as you might suspect, to a lot of the other 3rd generation firearms. It has all of those attributes and details. And again, you can take a closer look at this. This side of the frame, again, is or this side of the pistol, I should say, is pretty standard. We have Smith & Wesson rolled stamped here at the in the slide, and Smith & Wesson there with the Mass and USA serial number and model number there. On the right side, we just have a Smith & Wesson trademark stamp. There's no other markings on the right side of the pistol, and just on the left side do we have the other information here that you normally find on the pistol. It's a 4-inch barrel. These were actually supplied in 5.5 as well as a Performance Center version. So they did make a larger Performance Center version of these, but obviously the traditional or duty weapon would have been this 4-inch model 4006. And everything else is very, very similar to the other 3rd generation firearms that you've seen on the channel. Very, very nice machining work. We again have this flat or matte brushed stainless on the top to reduce glare. We have traditional rear serrations on both sides of the firearm. We have a ambi decocker and safety, and we've talked about that in other videos. We can go through that again real quick on how that functions. We kind of just working over the rest of this particular slide. Now this is different on this particular pistol. These are not the factory sights that would have came with this firearm. If memory serves me right, they would have been a Novak style sight like on this 5906. We have this rear kind of ramped type style sight, but traditional 3-dot for front and rear. So again, something similar to that. We have a traditional front sight here. And these appear to be essentially aftermarket night sights, and there are no markings on these sights whatsoever, so I have no idea what manufacturer they were. They are basically dead. There's some very, very light glow to them, but they're basically dead at this point. And but this particular rear sight does give a shelf, which I always like, and I kind of have commented in a little bit one of my few negatives on the Smith & Wesson 3rd gen firearms, but it was just the what was going on in that particular era and time frame, and also with the Novak influence, are these Novak rear or ramped rear sights, but doesn't really give you anywhere to do a one-handed manipulation if you needed to. But at least this particular aftermarket sight has that. So these were aftermarket night sights with this nice shelf. Kind of working our way down onto the frame, traditional slide lock, slide release. We've already talked a little bit about the frame. Of course, both components are solid stainless steel. Moving just down, we have, again, this traditional wraparound grip that Smith & Wesson was using on all of its third generation firearms. It has a very nice beaver tail. It has, as we just talked about, it has the front serrations on the front strap. It still has a very, very nice beveled here underneath the portion underneath the trigger guard, and there's still stippling or putting in an aggressive texture on the front of that trigger guard. So a lot of third gen features here that you've seen on some of the other firearms. A beveled magwell. So that looks, again, very third gen traditional, very nicely done, well machined. And they were supplied with, it depends, 11 shot or, these were 11 shot 40 caliber magazines, metal magazines again. We've talked about these before, very well made. This one is actually stamped 40 Smith & Wesson. The interesting thing about these magazines, they were specifically designed for the 40 caliber cartridge, and they were also designed to ensure that they wouldn't fit in a 9mm firearm. So they have this knob or bubble in the metal to ensure that it will not fit in a 5906, because obviously the magazines are going to look very different. Sometimes there is some color designation to the followers. This one's blue. I've also seen yellow for 40 Smith & Wesson. But again, very, very well made magazines. I don't think anybody ever complains about Smith & Wesson magazines of this era. Probably one of the other interesting things about this particular firearm is the connection to one of the other ones we've had on the channel, and that's the version that they created for the California Highway Patrol, which is the 40 Smith & Wesson Tactical, and we've got a video on that. If you haven't seen that, please check that out. There's some very distinct differences to the TSW versions that Smith & Wesson was making. The most obvious right here, you can see the integrated rail into the frame, but there's a number of other changes and features to this, specifically to the TSW versions that the California Highway Patrol then used for years. And this firearm is even just a little heavier still, if I remember right. I didn't pull that particular data, but this one does feel a little heavier than actually the 4006, not by much though. But of course, this one does not have any kind of rail. And I bought this used. It was in excellent condition again. Fortunate to continue to find a lot of these Smith & Wessons in very, very good condition. Just kind of fortunate when you find that. It does look like they're using an MIM hammer, right? MIM style hammer, I should say, material for the hammer. But this is a traditional double action, single action, third generation Smith. It does have the magazine disconnect, as we've talked about before. It would have had to have been a special configuration from Smith & Wesson, probably called out by a specific police department not to have the magazine disconnect. If you're not familiar with that, again, real quick, it just the firearm has to have the magazine inserted in order for the trigger to actually work. And so that's a kind of a safety feature, harking back to actually their model 39 and 59, with those were built into that firearm as well. And again, I already stated it's traditional double action, single action, which means that the first pull is long but smooth. to engage the firearm. The slide would rack and you would be in this configuration. If you were chambering the round to then carry it, you would drop the hammer safely with the decocker and then either carry in this fashion, or the more traditional mode of carry would have been then to re-engage the safety and come to this position with a round in the chamber, but obviously fully loaded magazine. So that's the 4006. What do I like and dislike about it? Again, as usual, I have very, very few dislikes on Smith & Wesson 3rd gens. I mean, I'm a fan, so probably a biased or jaded opinion, but I have no problems really with these firearms. Again, you could argue there's no rail, but there's a lot of firearms, especially from this time frame, that don't have a rail. And of course, there's some folks that kind of think 1911s and SIG P series, etc., without the rail are elegant and vintage and all that. So I think this kind of falls into that category. And then really my other pet peeve generally is the sights from that Novak ramp style, where you can't really rack the slide one-handed if you had to, but this one has solved that problem. So there really are no dislikes to this pistol at all. In fact, I shot it side by side with a SIG 229 in 40 cal, and very, very similar. It was just really enjoyable to shoot, almost surprisingly so. And I wasn't, since I owned the TSW version, the 4006 TSW, I really thought I had kind of checked this box. But when I walked into this shop and the price point was just kind of crazy low, I just couldn't really pass it up. And again, it was in such nice condition. And then when I shot it, it was just so enjoyable. It's just, I enjoy shooting 40 cal generally in heavier all steel or metal guns. And this was not a disappointment. It was just very enjoyable to shoot. I really liked it. And it was very, very similar to the SIG 229, actually. Obviously, they have slightly different trigger feels, etc. But the guns were both very accurate and both very enjoyable to shoot in 40 cal. So I'm very, very glad I picked this up and kind of added it to the collection. If you happen to come across one and you like 40 cal, or maybe you can't find the TSW one, I would not hesitate to pick this up at all. The only other interesting side note to it is it definitely seems to have a heavier spring to it for the slide that may be mitigating recoil a little bit. Again, but completely, the function and reliability was 100%. Again, I bought this gun used, so you're never quite sure what other people have done to it. It just feels like it has a heavier spring to it. That's really the only major difference I can pick up on from the 4006 TSW, or even the 5906 or the 4506. So that's the only difference. But other than that, the gun, like I said, shot extremely well and was very enjoyable. So I hope you guys like that. I hope the kind of the sidebar almost on the history side was interesting. I find it fascinating. I think this whole, as I've said before, these century plus timeline that Smith & Wesson has, this connection to law enforcement is so interesting to me, and all of the different cartridges that they've created along their path. And the 40 Smith & Wesson is no exception to that. It's just a very, very interesting part of Smith & Wesson history. And again, I think sometimes this cartridge development kind of gets overlooked with what Smith & Wesson has done in the industry over the years. The firearms get a lot of attention, but you forget how involved Smith & Wesson was with this cartridge development. But again, I hope you liked the video. Please continue to subscribe and like and send us comments, and we'll see you all next time on the Daily Defender.